Well, today we're going to have a quick little conversation about a book that both JJ Bond and myself have read recently called A Church Called Tov. This conversation, this recording originally is for our It Runs in the Family series, although I'm sure we'll use it for other purposes down the road. But anyway, JJ, you are our Adult Ministries Director here at our Mid-Rivers campus. I serve with our online ministries. We've worked together for a long time. Had many of these conversations over the last 10 years or so, just as we talk about church and what the church is and what it looks like to do church. And sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's beautiful, and sometimes it's both. Yeah. And anyway, so for this, this book, it's called A Church Called Tov. It's Scot McKnight and his daughter, Laura. They were involved for a time at a church called Willow Creek, a church that Calvary has been associated with, not closely, but part of a larger kind of church network for a season of growth back in the 90s, maybe early 2000s. And if you've, spent time reading or listening to church news, Willow Creek's kind of blown up in some different ways. Stories of abuse of power, bad culture, leadership failure, and so, but it's not a unique story. It's a story that we've seen in churches, many churches, for a while now. And so anyway, they wrote this book. Not as much to just bash Willow Creek and other churches, but to call the church, the larger church, to a culture of goodness and beauty. And there's things that we can do as a church to help make this a place that is safe, that people are known, where truth is nurtured, where grace is nurtured. And so we just want to have a little just conversation, not as much about the book, but about how do we as a church, right? We're in this, it runs in the family. Yes. It runs in the family. Like, we've looked at different things that we want to run in the family. These other one another statements that are found in the New Testament. Love one another, teach one another, honor one another, encourage one another. I think even though it's not one of those, but like we want to be good to one another. And so that's kind of where we are at. So I just wanted to ask you, just as we start like this conversation, what are some of the impressions that this book has made for you, and just these stories of abuse of power, of leadership failure? What impact have these had on you as a person, as a pastor, as a church member? And then what effect or what impact do you think that these have had on the wider church?
I first heard about this book through my mentor, and then I saw it was going to be one of the resources we were using for the One Another series. So I picked up the book, I started reading, and immediately had all kinds of feelings. Sad, mad, convicted. The book begins kind of identifying what a toxic culture looks like, and then the latter part of the book is how do you create a Tov culture, a goodness culture. And this word Tov, you're the Hebrew expert, but it is...
Wouldn't say expert.
Yes, Hebrew
I had
word.
a couple classes.
Hebrew word meaning good.
Yeah.
And it's used in the creation narrative.
Yeah, so Genesis 1, each day God saw what he had made, saw that it was good, saw that it was Tov.
Yes, it was good. And, we know what happens with Adam and Eve and their decision to rebel against God and enter sin and brokenness into the world. So we know that the church is a beautiful mess. Yeah. And there's always going to be a level of toxic culture that exists in the church, I think, because of that. But our calling is to be a church that exudes Tov culture and goodness. And I think that's been one of the things that's been helpful about this, going through this One Another series, is it gives us a glimpse of heaven, I think, but also a glimpse of what the church could look like. And one of the things with the story that Scott shares about Willow Creek and Bill Hybels that really had an impact on me as you think about leaders like Bill Hybels and their influence is coming out of college. He had written a book called Holy Discontent.
Mm-hmm.
And that book had a profound impact on my life, the story that he writes in that book. So to see a leader with the influence he has, the platform he's been given through Willow Creek and even the Global Leadership Summit, to see him fall like this, it stings a little, but it's also like it can happen to anybody.
Yeah, it's one of those stories where, and it's one of many, unfortunately, stories we've seen of different Christian leaders fall, abuse of power, sexual misconduct, what have you. I think of Mark Driscoll, right? Listening to the Rise and the Fall of Mars Hill, that podcast, and it's a gripping story. Yeah. And I think the people who are making it, they're doing a good job of hey, this is one example, but how did we as a collective church get here? And like Mark Driscoll, I mean, he was somebody that I listened to some of his podcasts. I read a couple of his books, but man, if you grew up in the church or in the youth world in the early 2000s, people were mimicking him, right? He was a popular guy. He was somebody that people were looking to as a model, and so that's impactful. And I think of Ravi Zacharias, and others. So what do we do with these stories? Because these stories have an impact on the wider church. They have an impact on our mission. They have, they should be teaching us something.
Yeah, and I think they probably impact a lot of people's faith too, and faith in the church, and specifically the leadership in the church. So we've wrestled, we've had these conversations a lot of okay, what does, and we wouldn't use, we wouldn't say Tov culture, but how do you create healthy leadership structures, whatever you want to call it, within a church, in hopes that you prevent some of the things that we're seeing, reading, and listening to on podcasts.
And people are broken, right? So even systems in the best of intentions are going to break down on some level. And so when they do, right, what do we do? What should we focus on? How do we not just prevent, but enter into the next steps well? So I guess for this, let's focus maybe more on Tov, right? What does it look like for us as a church to be a church that could be described as Tov, that it could be described as having a goodness culture? Maybe less on the toxicity that's gotten us here, but I guess, what's for us as a church?
Yeah.
How can we be Tov to one another?
I think a lot of it has to do with what we've been talking about as we've walked through this series. Loving one another, honoring one another. I think bearing with one another. I think that's a big deal, that along with forgiving one another. I think all the things that we've covered in this One Another series are marks of what a Tov culture looks like. And one of the things he talks about in the book, I think it's one of the first things, is empathy. And I think when I think of empathy, and even how he defines it in the book, is the ability to sit with others in their messiness, in their pain, with whatever's going on. Being able to be with them, not necessarily have the answer, not making any judgments, but really bearing with, walking with. I think a lot of the things that we've covered in this series, that's what I think about when I think of, good culture and a good church.
Well, and empathy, right, is so other-centric, right? If you can't imagine what it's like to be in that person, if someone is going to come and confess something or report something or whatever, if you can't empathize what it's like to be that person, then where do you go? You go to yourself. Okay, well, how is this going to impact me? There's one account in this book that I really resonated with, where it was somebody who was a pastor at the church, and there was something that had happened in their church before he was even a pastor there, and his immediate thing was, okay, let's do this. Let's sit in. Like, he apologized to the church. He wasn't even there. He apologized to the church. He listened to the person. And again, that's a very specific example, but I do think that, unfortunately, and we're in the middle of a pandemic right now too, that our questions are so often, how does this affect me?
Yeah.
And the way that Scott even talks about empathy, he describes it to like nurture empathy. It's like not just like something that you're either empathetic or you're not. Like, it's something that you have to massage it, you have to grow in it, you have to do things that are going to lead to you being more empathetic in the future. And if you can't understand someone's story, where they're coming from, it makes it really hard to be in a proper relationship with them.
Sure.
And that's what the church is.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, we don't always know someone else's story, or we don't always know someone else's mourning.
Yeah.
So they may come in, and you may have an interaction with them that is, semi-unpleasant. We don't know what happened that morning for them. So I think the awareness it takes, the gentleness it takes to be with, but also, we may not know. We might not have a full picture. We're just getting a snapshot or a glimpse. And I think once we are able to hear, their story and listen, I think in many ways makes it easier to be empathetic. Because some cases we just
don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. And I do think that, I think of Philippians chapter 2, right? It talks about Jesus and what he has done just to get to the point of, through the incarnation, he gave up heaven. He emptied himself, is how the text describes it. He came to earth. He humbled himself, even to the point of death on a cross. And man, how often, humility is just not something that, humility is not a normal thing.
No.
Right? It's not a normal thing for us to strive
naturally.
for. It doesn't come naturally. And yet, I think all of the things, the different chapters in this book, Tov churches nurture empathy. Tov churches nurture truth. Tov churches nurture justice and service and Christ-likeness. You have to start with a posture of humility.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, and I'll ask you this question. When you say that, and when you use the word nurture, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, the first image, right? You think of a baby.
Yeah.
You think of how you would handle a baby and how, a mother, right, nurtures her child.
Yeah.
That's where my mind goes. There's a fragility,
yes.
right, to it. That it's not something that it's not something that just happens. It takes time. It takes learning. I think of when we brought James home from the hospital, and we're new parents, and we're like, okay, how the heck did anyone say this was okay? Who gave us permission to have a baby,
yes.
in our house that we're responsible for raising? But let's not even get to there. He's crying, and we don't know why he's crying. So there's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of learning his sounds, his facial expressions, how he responds to certain things. It's a dance, right? There's a lot of back and forth. And I think when it comes to the church, when it comes to nurturing a goodness culture, there's going to be a lot of that. We're going to have to do this together. We're going to have to learn, okay, this situation, this person has had, they have this story. I handled it this way last time. Oh man, that didn't work.
Sure.
Intention was right, execution not. I wasn't present. I was busy. So I don't know, that's the illustration that comes to my mind is it's a careful, delicate dance.
Yes. And that's exactly what I was thinking as you were running through that, because like to your point with the illustration that you use, when you bring a child home, a baby home for the first time, you put them in that car seat and they look so tiny and small. Like gentleness is the first word that comes to mind.
That's good.
And making sure, and you do everything like a little bit slower, right? And I think some of those things.
Yeah, when you guys brought Michaela home, how fast were you driving on the highway?
Oh, we're very slow, taking all the the back roads so we could, keep it under 40 miles an hour.
Yeah. So question then. And I said I was going to ask you this. You said, don't ask me that. I'm going to ask you this.
All right, here we go.
Is Calvary, is our church, like, would you use the word Tov to describe the culture of our church? If yes, why? If no, what do we got to do to get there? But then also, maybe more importantly, like, what does Tov, what does a goodness culture have to do with our mission as a church, our mission and our identity?
Yeah, that's a good question that I don't want to answer. I think Calvary does have a Tov culture, but I also do think, to the statement I made earlier, there are elements of a toxic culture that exist.
Yeah. In any church, in any culture, yes.
Yes, any culture, any organization, yes, both exist.
Wherever people are, there's beauty and there's brokenness.
Yep.
Yeah.
Beautiful mess, man. So I was actually listening to a recent podcast where I think the guy being interviewed answered it well. And if I remember correctly, his name's Steve Clark, who was going to be, Bill Hybels was actually grooming him to take over at Willow Creek. And Carey Nieuwhof, he's doing this interview with Steve, and one of the things he said is that there were a few men that failed. Bill Hybels, and apparently there was a few more. Sure. Maybe, I don't know if they were helping cover up or what. He said, Jesus never failed me. He said, Willow Creek Church never failed me. Because I think sometimes when we experience toxic culture and we read these stories of all these leaders who unfortunately fallen, it can impact our faith and how we view the church, but also how we view God. And I thought that was really interesting as he took a step back and answered that question. He said, look, it really didn't impact my faith all that much because God never failed me in that whole thing. And the church itself never failed me. There's a lot of people at Willow Creek that I dearly love. Yeah. It was just Bill Hybels and a handful of others that made some poor choices. Yeah. So I think, to answer your question, I think Calvary does have a Tov culture. And I think you see fruit of that because people are coming and we're making an impact on our community. People are growing spiritually. So you see the fruit of what a Tov culture looks like. You see Christ in this church. And it doesn't mean that the messiness and brokenness is non-existent. But that's also our journey as believers. There's times I mess up on the daily. But also, I think my wife, my kids, this church, my workplace, they see fruit.
Well, and maybe Tov is less of a destination, less of a you're either Tov or you're not, right? And maybe it's more of similar to the idea of being faithful, right? Yeah. Like, you can say you've been faithful in the past, but it's the future that matters, right? Like, and the future is, are you faithful? Are you going to continue to be faithful? And Tov maybe similar, less of a line, more of a spectrum, right? There's elements that are beautiful, there's elements that are broken, and can we have grace with one another? Can we be quick to listen? Can we be quick to apologize? Can we be quick to pursue truth and to pursue wholeness and to pursue goodness and justice and service and all of the things really that are in there? Cool. The impact on the mission. for the church, right? Like,
Yeah.
why is this necessary?
Oh, it's necessary because the church is the world's glimpse of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
I think it matters and it's necessary and it's a must because we are reflecting Christ to the world. And Jesus is perfect. He is good. He is the Savior that God the Father sent Jesus the Son into our messiness, so that we could see what Tov looks like. And ultimately, he died for our sin, and he made a way, and he's given us the gift of the Holy Spirit that empowers us to live out Tov in this world.
So good. I just want to end with one of the things that Terry said, I think in the very beginning of this series, was if we could all come to church with the question, how can I love someone else today? I think we probably go a long way towards realizing this Tov culture that I think we all would say is so important to us. Yeah. Cool. Jay, really thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for your vulnerability, for your sharing. Hopefully this conversation has been helpful, meaningful to you as well. And thank you for joining us.